Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and this is Side 1 of For the Record program number 665, titled Update on the Meltdown, Part 2. This is being recorded on March 1st of the year 2009. This program, like many, and in fact, like just about all the For the Record programs now, should be accessed in print as well as on audio. Go to www.spitfirelist.com, the best website in the world for this kind of information, anti-fascist research. It's an invaluable resource, and if you're only listening to the audio portions of the broadcast, you're missing the better part of the For the Record experience. There literally is a world of research available for free at www.spitfirelist.com. Books, article-length descriptions of the For the Record shows, everything I've ever recorded available for download for free on MP3. So please utilize that resource, because in case you hadn't noticed, folks, it's later than you think. And boy, I tell you, even if you think it's pretty late, it's later than that, Jack or Jill, as the case may be. So please do that. And I know money is tight, but I'll tell you, if you want to stay alive, don't worry about being able to pay the bills. You want to stay alive. There's no better way of helping to ensure that than to support the work that I'm doing. Because let me tell you, the warm and brown has hit the fan. You want some numbers? We're going to be talking about the economic meltdown. You say you want some numbers? Let's try some numbers. The following is from C-SPAN of February 9th of 2009. It's posted by Mark Frauenfelder. It's titled, Representative Kanjorski, $550 billion disappeared in, quote, electronic run on the banks. The URL will be available in the description for the Record 665. It reads, the Capital Markets Subcommittee Chair Representative Paul Kanjorski of Pennsylvania tells C-SPAN how the world economy almost collapsed in a matter of hours. At 2 minutes 20 seconds into this C-SPAN video clip, Kanjorski reports on a, quote, tremendous drawdown of money market accounts in the United States to the tune of $550 billion. According to Kanjorski, this electronic transfer occurred over the period of an hour or two. Kanjorski, quote, the Treasury opened its window to help. They pumped $105 billion into the system and quickly realized that they could not stem the tide. We were having an electronic run on the banks. They decided to close the operation, close down the money accounts, and announce a guarantee of $250,000 per account so there wouldn't be further panic there. And that's what actually happened. If they had not done that, their estimation was that by 2 o'clock that afternoon, $5.5 trillion would have been drawn out of the money market system of the United States, and it would have collapsed the entire economy of the United States, and within 24 hours, the world economy would have collapsed. So kudos to the people that at least temporarily stemmed that tide. What's that you say? You want some more numbers? Thought that might be the case, so check this out. This from Bloomberg News. It's also February 9th. It's by Mark Pittman and Bob Every. Headline, U.S. taxpayers risk $9.7 trillion on bailout programs. By the way, the URLs for all of these Internet articles will be available in the descriptions for the program. Again, U.S. taxpayers risk $9.7 trillion on bailout programs. It reads in part, the stimulus package the U.S. Congress is completing would raise the government's commitment to solving the financial crisis to $9.7 trillion, enough to pay off more than 90% of the nation's home mortgages. The Federal Reserve, Treasury Department, and Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation have lent or spent almost $3 trillion over the past 2 years and pledged up to $5.7 trillion more. The Senate is to vote this week on an economic stimulus measure of at least $780 billion. It would need to be reconciled with an $819 billion plan the House approved last month. Only the stimulus bill to be approved this week, the $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program passed 4 months ago, and $168 billion in tax cuts and rebates enacted in 2008 would have been voted on by lawmakers. The remaining $8 trillion is in lending programs and guarantees, almost all under the Fed and FDIC. Recipients' names have not been disclosed. Quote, we've seen money go out the back door of this government unlike any time in the history of our country, unquote, Senator Byron Dorgan, a North Dakota Democrat, said on the Senate floor February 3rd. Again, quoting, Nobody knows what went out of the Federal Reserve Board, to whom and for what purpose. How much from the FDIC? How much from TARP? That's the Troubled Assets Relief Program. When and why? The pledges, amounting to almost two-thirds of the value of everything produced in the U.S. last year, are intended to rescue the financial system after the credit market seized up about 18 months ago. The promises are composed of about $1 trillion in stimulus packages, around $3 trillion in lending and spending, and $5.7 trillion in agreements to provide aid. The total already tapped has decreased about 1% since November, mostly because foreign central banks are using fewer dollars in currency exchange agreements called swaps. Federal Reserve lending to banks peaked at a record $2.3 trillion in December, dropping to $1.83 trillion by last week. The Fed balance sheet is still more than double the $880 billion it was in the week before September 17th, when it agreed to accept lower quality collateral. The worst financial crisis in 2 generations has erased $14.5 trillion, or 33% of the value of the world's companies since September 15th, brought down Bear Stearns and Companies and Lehman Brothers Holdings Incorporated, and led to the takeover of Merrill Lynch and Company and by Bank of America Corporation. The $9.7 trillion in pledges would be enough to send a $1,430 check to every man, woman, and child alive in the world today. It's 13 times what the U.S. has spent so far on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, according to Congressional Budget Office data, and is almost enough to pay off every home mortgage loan in the U.S., calculated at $10.5 trillion by the Federal Reserve. By the way, Paul Krugman of the New York Times, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, although he said that the Obama bailout program would be helpful, he said he didn't think it was large enough, and that to avoid a lost decade like Japan had, we needed a larger Keynesian program right off the bat. So it remains to be seen what happened. Now, a lot of money has been going out the door of various places for quite some time. A lot of it, and this is going to be one of the major focal points of this broadcast, a lot of it has gone to criminal activity. We're not going to have time to spend much, to dwell too much on it today, but one should never lose sight of why I have the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, available for download for free, the tremendous risks in doing so notwithstanding, and also why I've accessed the book Gold Warriors by Peggy and Sterling Seagrave so often. Those books talk about World War II, about the globalization program, which really led to fascism in World War II, and the sub rosa cornering of virtually all of the liquid wealth of Europe and Asia by, respectively, the Third Reich and Imperial Japan, cartel partners of major American corporate interests, including the Bush family. Time permitting, we may talk about that later in the broadcast, but I will write about it in the description to the broadcast. Please use the Spitfire List website. But a lot of this is criminal activity by what we've spoken of in our conversations with Daniel Hopsicker as elite deviants. And no discussion of elite deviants would be complete without an update of one of the major focal points of Update on the Meltdown Part 1, namely Lee Harvey Madoff, the self-professed lone nut of the largest Ponzi scheme in history. The reason why I use that term, when Bernard Madoff was busted, he said, "Nope, I'm the only one involved," and that is literally laughable under the circumstances. A whole lot of people were involved. It remains to be seen just how the investigation of this pans out, but I would not hold my breath expecting for a complete shedding of light into these very dark corners indeed. The following article is by Zachary Roth. It's from the TP Muckraker website. Again, full URL available in the description. It's by Zachary Roth, January 6, 2009. Securities and Exchange Commission Inspector General can't compel testimony from key Madoff witnesses. They're not going to have subpoena power, or at least very limited subpoena power. So again, don't hold your breath. This reads, yesterday we noted that based on his testimony before Congress, SEC Inspector General David Kotz appears to be conducting an aggressive investigation of the agency's failures in connection with the Bernard Madoff case. But on one crucial point, Kotz's testimony was much less heartening. Questioned by lawmakers about his authority to gain access to documents and witness testimony, Kotz admitted that he didn't have the power to subpoena former SEC employees for their testimony. We'll post the, well, it then goes on to advise about the posting of video. Continuing, here's why that matters. 3 SEC enforcement staffers, Assistant Regional Director Doria Bockenheimer, Branch Chief Megan Cheung, and Staff Attorney Simona Su were listed on the closing document, unquote, for the 2006-07 inquiry into Maddoff, which has emerged as Exhibit A in the case against the agency. According to an SEC enforcement source, only Sue, S-U-H, the most junior of the 3, remains at the agency. A receptionist at the agency's New York office, where all 3 had been based, confirmed to T.P. Muckraker that Bockenheimer and Cheung were no longer worked at the SEC. So Kotz won't have the power to compel testimony from the 2 SEC staffers who were perhaps the most central, on-the-ground players in the agency's failure to catch Maddoff. That may well limit his ability to draw broad conclusions about the SEC's slip-up and how to avoid similar mishaps in the future. That doesn't sound too encouraging. One of the interesting things about this is that the investigation into this is going to apparently be using, it's not a remarkable investigative tool, but they're actually going to be going to one of the top people in the Maddoff Fund, one Frank DiPascali. The following is from forexdaily.org. It's a internal Wall Street Journal article by Aaron Lucchetti, Amir Efrati, and Tom Lauricella. It's datelined January 21st of 2009. Wall Street Journal. It's actually a Wall Street Journal from, January 21st. Wall Street Journal. Maddoff point man cast in same role for prosecutors. It reads in part, as a key lieutenant to investor Bernard Maddoff for more than 30 years, Frank DiPascali Jr. said he headed stock options trading and was the point man for investment advisory clients who were told he executed their trades. Now he is a potential point man in the investigation of a Ponzi scheme that Mr. Maddoff has told prosecutors he carried out over decades, bilking investors out of $50 billion. Prosecutors are interested in information Mr. DiPascali, 52 years old, can provide about the inner workings of Mr. Maddoff's operation, who, if anyone else, knew about the fraud and where the money went, according to people familiar with the matter. Mr. DiPascali hasn't been charged with wrongdoing. His lawyer, Mark Mukasey, declined to comment about Mr. DiPascali's role with Mr. Maddoff, except to say that he had frequent contact with investors. By the way, Mark Mukasey is the son of the former Attorney General, and actually, I think Mr. Mukasey might still be the Attorney General. Anyway, I'd have to double check that. There's been so much going on. Even I occasionally miss something. But in any event, as soon as the Maddoff case broke, Mr. Mukasey, the Attorney General, recused himself from the investigation. His son is representing Mr. DiPascali. We're also going to take a look at just what law firm his son works for. The following is from the Bloomberg News Service. This is by David Voriakos, David Glovin, and Patricia Hurtado. It is datelined January 6th of 2009, and actually January 16th of 2009. It's headlined, Maddoff's street-smart aide DiPascali was investors' go-to guy. One wonders how they concluded he was street-smart. I guess that's sort of the word on this guy. Frank DiPascali Jr. joined Bernard Maddoff's firm a year after graduating from a Catholic high school in Queens, New York. Over a 33-year career, he rose through the ranks, eventually calling himself Chief Financial Officer. For investors like Tim Murray of Minnesota, DiPascali was a street-smart New Yorker who fielded calls about the millions of dollars he entrusted to the firm. Quote, to a Maddoff customer with a discretionary account, he is the guy, unquote, said Murray, 57, a real estate developer. There is nobody else, unquote. Now, again, he's being represented by Mark Mukasey, the son of Micah Mukasey, the Attorney General at the time that the investigation broke. Skipping down, Maddoff often told investigators that options trading was a key to his success. DiPascali, who was not charged, became director of options at 1986 at the firm and chief financial officer in 1996, according to a resume he prepared in 2002. Quote, Mr. DiPascali is a blue-collar guy, not a Wall Street master of the universe, unquote, said his attorney Mark Mukasey, a former federal prosecutor now at, check this out, Bracewell and Giuliani, LLP, in New York. Quote, he is devastated by the losses to investors, unquote. Yeah, bet he is. That, of course, is the law firm Bracewell and Giuliani. That is none other than the law firm of Rudy Giuliani, who helped to investigate BCCI, along with current FBI head Robert Mueller. Giuliani, of course, is Rudy the Rock, who was mayor of New York City and now is doing motivational talks around the country, as well as heading up his law firm. Again, well-connected people involved in these things. And more about where the money went. The following is a Reuters story, Thursday, January 29th of 2009. This is by Sve Herbst Bayless. It's Dateline Boston, headline, New talk of who escaped Madoff scheme sparks anger. Reads in part, Bernard Madoff's alleged massive financial fraud has sparked more outrage as news circulates that a major U.S. bank may have cashed out early while other investors were left high and dry. The New York Times reported on Thursday that J.P. Morgan Chase & Company suddenly began pulling its money out of two hedge funds that invested with Madoff last fall before Madoff was arrested, but they did not tell investors. According to the newspaper, J.P. Morgan said its potential losses related to Madoff are, quote, pretty close to zero, unquote. J.P. Morgan Chase spokeswoman Kristen Lemkow did not return several calls seeking comment. As lawyers and investors digested the story, they began questioning how big players may have been able to protect themselves from Madoff, while small investors were left exposed. Well, I don't think that. Why were the big investors able to protect themselves and the small investors left exposed? Cannot imagine how such a thing could happen. Skipping down, it's just shocking how many banks did this, said Harry Sussman, a partner at law firm Sussman Godfrey, which is representing investors who claim they lost millions. Quote, they seem to be making loans backed only by Bernie Madoff's separately managed accounts, and no one seemed to have checked those. By the way, later we're going to take a look at attempts at performing triage on this just elite deviant rip-off behavior. But again, no, this was J.P. Morgan Chase & Company that seems to have gotten a whiff. They were able to sniff the breezes and get their money out. Their exposure was next to zero. How do you suppose that might happen? Well, the following article, I think, gives us a hint about where we might start looking. This is on the Zero Hedge blog spot, January 14th, posted by Tyler Durden. Headline, Breaking Expose. So where are Frank and Charlie? It reads in part, with the public's attention having been exclusively focused on Bernie, his sons Mark and Andrew, and Bernie's three-man accountant company, unquote, led by David Freeling, a question that is intriguing more and more people is who, what, and where are Frank DiPasquale, the 51-year-old CFO of Bernard L. Madoff, and Charles Weiner, Bernie's 50-year-old nephew, listed as Director of Administration, who were the only other tenants of floor 17 of 885 3rd Avenue. Well, we now know that Frank DiPasquale is the lead investigator being represented by the son of the Attorney General at the time the scandal broke, and that he in turn is working for Rudy Giuliani's law firm. Skipping down. Speaking of DiPasquale, Frank is married to Joanne DiPasquale of Howard Beach, who is an employee of Morgan Chase National Association, the private banking arm of J.P. Morgan. Now, I wonder how J.P. Morgan Chase & Company might have gotten word that things weren't quite all right at the Madoff operation. How do you suppose they managed to sniff the breezes and go, I've got a hunch. Maybe we ought to get our money out of the Madoff fund. I don't know. Can you figure it out? Beginning this paragraph again, Frank is married to Joanne DiPasquale of Howard Beach, who is an employee of J.P. Morgan Chase National Association, the private banking arm of J.P. Morgan. As noted here, Joanne works out of JPM's Island, New Jersey office, which is where the firm's mortgage business is centered. In this March 29, 2006 memo, the Island office provided its 2 cents on just how smoothly the non-traditional mortgage product market is operating. As seen in the following representative prospectus from a 2007 mortgage pool offering by that office, of the $473 million mortgage pool peddled probably by Mrs. DePascali, among others, only $181 million of mortgages had verification checks, $440 million are IOs, and average outstanding balance is $476,000. So the plot thickens. Husband is the chief financial officer to a Ponzi, as wife is potentially selling worthless mortgage pools. Well, that's interesting, but I can't figure out, how did J.P. Morgan Chase get the word that this wasn't going to work out? I don't know. More about some of the many, many connections of the lone nut Lee Harvey Madoff. This from the Boston Globe of December 23rd of 2008, article by Casey Ross and Jen Abelson of the Globe. It's called Broker Tied to Ex-Hub Mob Leader. Jaffe did business with Angiulo in the 70s, reads in part, before Bernard L. Madoff, Robert M. Jaffe did business with another notorious rogue, former Boston mob leader Gennaro Angiulo. Jaffe under investigation for his ties to the Wall Street investor who authorities say confessed to running a Ponzi scheme, was the stockbroker to Angiulo and his brothers, reputed members of the Boston Mafia, before they were sent to jail on racketeering charges in 1986. By the way, whether or not it's relevant, the U.S. attorney for the Boston area throughout much of the 80s was none other than Robert Mueller, who proved less than vigorous in his examination of BCCI and wasn't really able to figure out who made off with all the funds at the BCCI. I'm still wondering, how did J.P. Morgan figure out when to how they were able to make off with the funds, how they made off with the funds of their investors. In addition to reputed mob associate Jaffe, by the way, a luminary in Palm Beach, Florida. Another interesting person, this going over to the European feeder funds of the Madoff operation. New York Times story of Sunday, January 11th of 2009 by Nelson D. Schwartz and Julia Werdiger. Madoff losses in Austria's woman on Wall Street. Dateline Vienna, Austria, it reads in part, with an aggressive style that stood out in the staid world of Austrian banking even more than her bouffant red wig, Sonia Cohn, K-O-H-N, made few friends gathering billions for Bernard L. Madoff from wealthy investors in Russia and across Europe. Now, she has even fewer friends. Cohn has dropped out of sight, leaving the firm she founded, Bank Medici, in the hands of Austrian regulators who took it over last week. Embarrassment from investing heavily with Madoff could explain wanting to disappear from public view. But another theory widely repeated by those who know Cohn is that she may be afraid of some particularly displeased investors. Russian oligarchs, whose money made up a chunk of the $2.1 billion that Bank Medici invested with Madoff. With Russian oligarchs as clients, said a Viennese banker who knew Cohn and her husband socially, she might have reason to be afraid, unquote. Well, yes, indeed. In addition to Ms. Cohn, another of the people who was helping to feed European money to Madoff was Mr. de Villachet, part of the French elite, a member of one of the elite families of France. As we looked at in Update on the Meltdown Part 1, a couple of people involved, in addition to Mr. de Villachet, also the Thiessens were deeply involved with Madoff, and I seriously doubt they got burned. You burn the Thiessens, one of the principal elements of the Borman Capital Network, and you will set a new world's indoor record for death. But I would concur with this assessment. I think Ms. Cohn definitely needs to be very, very afraid indeed. It says here that she is the daughter of Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe who moved to Vienna after World War II. Remember that the Borman Capital Network frequently uses Jews as front people because it makes a great cover. First of all, what better distraction for a Nazi money-moving operation than having Jews as front people? It also serves as a very, very good way of feeding the myth of the Jews controlling the banking system. When one of these operations goes belly up, people say, see, told you it was the Jews. And also, it was a very good way, including Jews in the Borman Capital Network, of keeping the Mossad and the Israelis quiet about the worldwide perpetuation of the Third Reich, something that took place underground and something that you can read about on the www.spitfirelist website. The Martin Bormann book is available for download for free. Remember, in Update on the Meltdown Part 1, we took a look at the alleged suicide of Mr. de Viechet. He supposedly committed suicide, and again, he was channeling money from all sorts of elite in Europe to the Maddoff Fund, supposedly committed suicide by slashing his wrists with a box cutter, except he had cuts on his bicep. Now, he also, according to the report, had taken some sleeping pills. Maybe that affected his aim, but still, missing, when you're aiming to cut your wrist, slicing your bicep by mistake, that's a pretty big miss. Of course, maybe that just alludes to the long arm of the law. We're going to conclude there are these sorts of massive ripoffs, and the Stanford Fund is now coming under scrutiny. So have a great many others. Belatedly, law enforcement is starting to take a very good look at these enormous ripoffs and the tremendous role they're playing in the global capital hemorrhaging. New York Times of February 13th, 2009 had this good news. It's an article by Andrew Ross Sorkin, New Powers Sought to Fight Financial Fraud. And as we looked at in our last interview with Lucy Commissar, the brilliant expert on offshore, Barack Obama was one of the co-authors of legislation to close some of these offshore rip-off centers. This article reads in part, the Justice Department is seeking expanded powers to prosecute offshore tax evasion and other financial crimes, including those related to the mortgage industry and potential misuse of government bailout money, the New York Times' Lindley Browning reports. The efforts, which have gained traction in recent weeks, could give the agency tougher prosecutorial tools to combat fraud amid the economic downturn. As part of the effort, the agency has thrown its weight behind a Senate anti-fraud bill that, if passed, would make it easier for the agency to apply money laundering statutes in cases of suspected tax evasion, particularly those involving offshore accounts. Hear, hear, says Dave. Continuing, a top Justice Department official laid out the aims on Wednesday in comments at a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on the bill known as the Fraud Enforcement and Recovery Act of 2009. Money laundering statutes generally carry stiffer penalties, are regarded more seriously by courts, and make it easier for prosecutors to force defendants to forfeit assets and make restitution, said Robert G. Morvillo, a white-collar criminal defense lawyer in New York. The Justice Department also wants to amend the criminal code to include broader definitions of financial institutions and mortgage lenders, and to extend bank fraud statutes to non-bank companies, particularly private mortgage lenders like Countrywide. It is also pushing Congress to amend the current major fraud statute to apply to any illegal transactions under the $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, and to the multi-billion-dollar stimulus package. The anti-fraud bill was introduced last week by Patrick J. Leahy, Democrat of Vermont, the committee's chairman, and Charles E. Grassley, Republican of Iowa, a senior member. The bill also seeks money to hire more prosecutors and investigators in various agencies. Rita M. Glavin, acting Assistant Attorney General of the Justice Department's Criminal Division, told the hearing that, quote, due to the rapid globalization of the financial system, again quoting, we have seen the development of a troubling growth of income tax evasion, unquote, that often involves, again quoting, the same methods and mechanisms as money laundering schemes, unquote, according to a transcript. So some people are starting to move on maybe closing some of these loopholes and trying to investigate where, well, I'm not going to call it funny money. This is very unfunny money indeed. But the loopholes definitely need to be closed. Whether this is closing the door after the horse has left, closing the barn door after the horse has left, remains to be determined. Certainly, I think all of us, the horse may have left the barn, but we're stuck with what the horse left behind, aren't we? This concludes Side 1 of For the Record program number 665, Update on the Meltdown, Part 2, being recorded on March 1st of 2009. My name's Dave Emory. Thanks for listening. Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and this is Side 2 of For the Record program number 665, Update on the Meltdown, Part 2. This is being recorded on March 1st of the year 2009. Well, we're going to plunge right in where we left off on side one. By the way, even I experienced the occasional senior moment in the heat of concentration, so to speak. Now, the current Attorney General is Eric Holder. Michael Mukasey was the last of Bush's attorneys general. His son Mark, working for Rudy Giuliani's law firm, is representing Frank DePascali, who was basically the go-to guy for Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. And, of course, Joanne DePascali, his wife, was working for J.P. Morgan Chase, and J.P. Morgan Chase just happened to be one of the companies that managed to get some dough out of there without alerting investors. They made off with the money, so to speak. Looming in the background, again, I'm not going to have time to go into it at great length in this broadcast, but looming in the background of these global money flows and global capital hemorrhaging looms the underground Reich, literally a third Reich that went underground and perpetuated itself in mafia-like style, using its tremendous amount of economic leverage. What one banker told the late Paul Manning, it was the greatest concentration of money power under a single control in history. In turn, it wasn't a lone nut operation, nor was it a freak occurrence. It was the outgrowth of the international cartel system, just as the Borman Capital Network corralled all of the liquid wealth of Europe for the underground Reich. So too, Imperial Japan corralled all of the liquid wealth of Asia for the Japanese fascist infrastructure, which also basically perpetuated itself after World War II. That can be accessed in the book Gold Warriors by Peggy and Sterling Seagraves, the Underground Reich and Borman Capital Network in the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile by the late, great Paul Manning, available for download for free on the Spitfire website, spitfirelist.com, the best source in the world for anti-fascist research. However, even though I said I was not going to go into great length, go into the Bormann Group at great length, of course, it looms in all probability in the background of the Madoff scheme, as well as very possibly elements of mafia. The Madoff operation was a global operation, and he was anything but the lone nut he claimed to be. We closed side two by taking a look at a bill that would enable the government to more effectively fight financial fraud, something we should all be supporting very, very wholeheartedly. Bloomberg.com has the following article from February 20th of 2009 by Christian Baumgartel. Its headline, Germany asks Liechtenstein's Prince Max to pay investment taxes. We've looked at Liechtenstein as one of the Underground Reich's money-moving operations in a number of programs, Alpha Males, that's FTR 530, as I recall, and also Alpha Males Part 2. The evidence is very strong there. And take a look at some of the interesting dates here. Again, this is February 20th. German tax authorities want Prince Max von und zu Liechtenstein to pay taxes on investment gains of a foundation set up by his family. LGT Group, the bank owned by Liechtenstein's royal family, said in a statement. Lawyers for Prince Max, who lived in Germany from January 1999 until January of 2000, and again since September of 2001, note that date, dispute the tax authorities' view and are working with them on a solution, LGT said in the statement, which was emailed to news organizations late yesterday. Quote, I have always fulfilled my tax duties in Germany to the best of my knowledge, unquote, said Prince Max, who is chief executive officer of LGT, and said in a statement also, quote, if contrary to my conviction it turns out that I owe taxes to the German state, I will meet my obligations promptly. Well, the 800-pound gorilla in the room here, of course, is the fact that Liechtenstein, basically, it's a lean, mean money laundering machine. It's a tiny little country. It is an independent country with like 30,000 people in it. It is also a monarchy, or was. They're obviously still, it was an absolute monarchy for a short period of time. It is inextricably linked with the Alpha Group, along with the Robert Bosch Foundation, and the Karl Duisberg Gesellschaft, and the Argentine-American either foundation or federation. I'm not sure what it is technically named. But those appear to be basically the MBA feeder programs for the Borman Capital Network. Mohammed Atta came to this country under the auspices of Karl Duisberg Gesellschaft, and we've talked about those in numerous broadcasts. Again, go to spitfirelist.com. German authorities have noted that a great many German citizens, as well as others, have been avoiding taxes by placing a lot of money in the Liechtenstein financial system. LGT Bank is basically owned by the royal family of Liechtenstein, which is very close to, basically little more than an outcropping of, the House of Habsburg. And the Habsburgs, of course, Karl von Habsburg, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and basically the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is the head of the UNPO, which seeks to use indigenous peoples, small native peoples, to break up larger countries. He is married to Francesca Thyssen-Bornemisza, said the heiress to part of the Bormann Capital Network. Old Fritz Thyssen was one of Hitler's earliest financial backers. Thyssen AG, formerly called Vereinigte Stahlwerke, one of the key elements of the international cartel system. Fritz Thyssen was funding Adolf Hitler in 1924, along with his American business partner George Herbert Walker, the great-grandfather of the recently departed former president of the United States, George Walker Bush. One of the interesting things here, note the timing, in addition to the fact that Germany now wants Liechtenstein to get up off of some of the ill-gotten gains that have been stashed, or gains that have been ill-gotten by stashing them in Liechtenstein's banks. Note that he lived in Germany from January of 1999 until January of 2000. Then he went back to Germany in September of 2001. Of course, that was a very portentous month. It was the month, of course, of the September 11th attacks. Looming very large in the background of those is Bank Al-Taqwa, the financial institution of the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamic fascist group allied with the Axis in World War II, and CIA, among other institutions in the post-World War II period. Yusef Nada, the head of that institution, was a Nazi spy in World War II, and the institution itself may very well have been set up by Francois Genoux, a Nazi banker and heir to the political last will and testament and collected literary works of Adolf Hitler, Martin Bormann, and Joseph Goebbels. LGT actually had accounts held for Bank Al-Taqwa, or basically Bank Al-Taqwa did some of their banking with the House of Liechtenstein's bank, LGT. In fact, Al-Taqwa was actually incorporated in Vaduz, Liechtenstein. So do note this here. Germany wants the House of Liechtenstein to pay some taxes. If, in fact, international investigators and legal authorities actually do start nosing around in Liechtenstein, they're going to come up with a lot of very interesting things indeed. But as we look at the meltdown, as we look at the enormous hemorrhaging of capital in these almost unimaginably large ripoffs. Remember that things like September 11th, the BCCI scam, Iran-Contra, and many other of these operations involving tremendous moving of capital, sub rosa, around the world. They overlap with criminal syndicates, drug trafficking, terrorism, and a great many other things indeed. When one goes into the book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, again available for download for free at spitfirelist.com, one of the main Bormann Capital Network banks is the Union Bank of Switzerland, which, by the way, took on some of the assets of the failed Enron organization. UBS is now the focal point of American investigators in the Obama administration. Applause for the Obama administration under these circumstances, is looking to get UBS to turn over information on as many as 52,000 U.S. customers who have concealed their accounts from the Internal Revenue Service in violation of tax laws. Almost certainly there are a lot of U.S. investors in LGT and Liechtenstein as well. The following is from the San Francisco Chronicle of Friday, February 20th of 2009. This is an AP story by Devlin Barrett, headlined, U.S. wants more names in UBS Bank secrecy case. Dateline Washington, it reads in part, a government lawsuit filed Thursday seeks the identities of tens of thousands of people who hid billions of dollars in assets from the IRS at the Swiss-based bank UBS AG. A defiant Swiss president pledged to maintain his country's bank secrecy laws. In the suit filed in Miami, the Obama administration wants UBS to turn over information on as many as 52,000 U.S. customers who concealed their accounts from the Internal Revenue Service in violation of tax laws. At a time when millions of Americans are losing their jobs, their homes, and their health care, it is appalling that more than 50,000 of the wealthiest among us have actively sought to evade their civil and legal duty to pay taxes, unquote, John DeCicco, the acting Assistant Attorney General, said in a statement. A deal announced Wednesday provides access to about 250 to 300 UBS customers who used Swiss banking secrecy laws to hide assets. To avoid prosecution, UBS agreed to pay $780 million, which Justice Department officials said was the largest ever in a criminal tax case. The bank's chairman, Peter Kurer, said UBS accepted full responsibility, unquote, for helping its U.S. clients conceal assets from the IRS. But that does not mean the bank is about to fork over information on thousands of other accounts. On Wednesday, the United States claimed in court papers there were close to 20,000 U.S. clients who hid assets through the UBS program. A day later, the number had climbed to 52,000. U.S. officials offered no immediate explanation for the revised estimates, but said it was another sign they are raising the pressure on the Swiss bank. Well, this is a very, very important case indeed. Basically, what we're looking at is the Obama administration's Justice Department putting heat on a key Borman Network bank. And that is something that generally carries very severe retribution. Next week, we're going to be updating events vis-a-vis September 11th and related matters, the Muslim Brotherhood, some of the old SAR Network and Operation Green Quest players. When I talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, we're always getting newer listeners to the broadcast. A station just came online in Sandpoint, Alaska. One should not lose sight of the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamic fascist organization, in my analysis, are basically the foot soldiers, and they are very numerous foot soldiers for the Underground Reich, really for the Underground Axis. Although I don't agree with everything that the Obama administration has done, it really is doing as good a job as could be expected and has been a breath of fresh air. I think that President Obama is literally in the most mortal of danger, and I think the stage is already set for another September 11th, only something far worse, maybe a nuclear September 11th. I'll go into some of those foreshadowing, some of those very ominous gases rising up from the lower seismic layers of power politics next week. But what Obama and what his Justice Department are doing is very, very good indeed. They're finally, somebody is going after the Borman assets. And if people think it's sort of arcane that I talk about the Borman Network, or that I spend as much time as I have on the remarkable, quintessentially important book, Gold Warriors by Peggy and Sterling Seagraves, it is because that's what controls the money. As the famed bank robber Willie Sutton said when they asked him why he robs banks, he goes, because that's where the money is. Well, the reason I talk about Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and Gold Warriors, that's where the money is. And, of course, money laundering is as Swiss as chocolate watchmaking and yodeling. So when people start looking for where the funny money's going and they start looking into Swiss banks, that portends some very, very grave things indeed. And again, I think it's great that the Obama administration is going after UBS. That will not go without retribution, mark my words. And I think the outlines of that retribution are already taking shape, and they are going to be devastating beyond belief, with a capital D and two capital Bs. Speaking of Switzerland, Newsmax.com did just exactly that on February 23rd of 2009. An article by Julie Crawshaw. It's headlined, Economist Warns Switzerland Could Go Broke. Economist Arthur Schmidt says Switzerland could go broke because Swiss banks extended billions in credit to Eastern European countries which now can't pay back the money. Quote, Switzerland, like Iceland, is threatened with a potential national bankruptcy, unquote, Schmidt told the Swiss daily Tagesanzeiger. Loans made in Swiss francs stimulated rapid economic growth in many Eastern European countries, Schmidt says, making Swiss currency very important. Swiss banks lent francs to local banks, which in turn lent them to their customers. Such loans were especially attractive because interest rates were much lower than required for loans in local currency. The system worked as long as exchange rates between Swiss and Eastern European countries remained reasonably stable. Now, Eastern European countries are falling, and more borrowers are having problems repaying their loans. Quote, because of the devaluations of the national currencies, the debt to Switzerland has increased by more than one-third, Schmidt notes. Again quoting, many of the Eastern European countries have serious payment difficulties and are virtually bankrupt, unquote. Schmidt says the value of Switzerland's currency could drop severely or its credit rating could be massively downgraded, creating economic trauma in a country traditionally regarded as a stronghold of financial stability. The franc could become an unstable soft currency, Schmidt says. Then Switzerland would perhaps be forced to abandon the franc and take on the euro, unquote. Note that. If the Swiss have to abandon the franc and take on the euro, that would fold them into the European Monetary Union, which, as I've spoken about in numerous broadcasts, is basically the realization of the plans for European and ultimately world political domination set forth by Friedrich List in the mid-19th century, who saw a German-dominated Central European Economic Union as a vehicle for achieving German world domination by unseating Britain as the top imperial power in the world. That is no longer Britain. We're sort of the top dog, I guess one could say, in that regard. And basically, the Third Reich took on the Friedrich List model for political control via economic control. In the description for the book Germany Plots with the Kremlin by T.H. Tettens, that description is available in the books section of SpitfireList.com. You will see an article that was written by Dorothy Thompson in the New York Herald Tribune in May of 1940, in which she predicted what would happen in the event of a Third Reich victory. It's basically what has taken place. So note, not only is Switzerland in dire shape economically, but if they have to abandon the franc, they're going to have to take on the euro, then they will be folded completely into the European Monetary Union. Switzerland isn't the only country that may be going down. Iceland has already melted down, so to speak. Perfect metaphor there. I'm going to be doing an entire program on the Icelandic meltdown. It's very interesting indeed, and will shine light on some very, very interesting phenomena. The Times Online, that's the Sunday Times of February 15th of 2009, that's the British London Times, not the New York Times, had the following story by Ian Day. Ireland, quote, could default on debt, unquote. It reads in part, fears are mounting that Ireland could default on its soaring national debt pile and continuing worries about its troubled banking sector. The cost of buying insurance against Irish government bonds rose to record highs on Friday, having almost tripled in a week. Debt market investors now rank Ireland as the most troubled economy in Europe. Simon Johnson, the former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, called for this weekend's meeting of G7 finance ministers to put Ireland's troubles at the top of the agenda. Johnson said, quote, don't please tell me more about the basic principles of financial reform unless and until you have addressed the Irish problem. And don't tell me the Irish have to sort this out for themselves. Eventually, the world always comes to help. Check your notes on Iceland. It's much better and much cheaper to come in early and decisively. We need a plan of action for Ireland, and we need it now, unquote. Pledges made by Ireland to support its banking sector amount to 220% of the country's annual economic output. The total loans held in Irish banks are more than 11 times the size of the country's economy. Following the scandal at Anglo-Irish Bank over undisclosed loans, the market fears there are more hidden problems that could ultimately fall to the state to resolve. So Ireland, formerly an economic tiger of Europe, now tottering perilously on the brink. They aren't the only ones. The United Kingdom itself may be going down. The following story is I neglected to note where I got this. Well, this will be available this comes from, the source is the Hennessy Group. I will have the URL for this. I unfortunately blew it in printing this up, but that's why the descriptions exist at spitfirelist.com. The ultimate source of the the source for the article is the Hennessy Group. This is datelined Wednesday, February 18th of 2009. I will annotate this in the sourcing in the description for the record 665. Headline: UK, quote, could experience a crash similar to Iceland, unquote. The global financial crisis could be entering a new and more treacherous phase, unquote, which could push international countries to the brink of failure and further hinder the global economic recovery, according to the Hennessy Group. Charles Guidante, co-founder of the Hennessy Group, points out that Iceland had one of the highest standards of living in the world just a few months ago, but after experiencing the fastest economic collapse in history, it is suffering from soaring unemployment as well as double-digit interest rates and inflation. Hennessy Group says there are other countries that share some of the same characteristics as Iceland, particularly with regards to its debt-to-economic output, and could be vulnerable to the same devastating effects of the financial crisis. It believes it is imperative that world leaders pursue the appropriate policies to stimulate trade and promote worldwide growth so it does not enter a global economic crisis similar to that of the 1930s. After privatizing the banking sector in 2000, Iceland's banks went from being largely domestic lenders to major international financial intermediaries with foreign assets worth nearly 10 times the country's GDP. As the banks dramatically expanded overseas and foreign money poured into the country, the Icelandic economy experienced exceptional growth and prosperity. Iceland was considered in 2007 to be one of the richest per capita countries in the world. However, as the global financial crisis picked up steam, it exposed the weakness and dependence of Iceland's economy on the banking sector, as well as its vulnerability to a staggering economic collapse. Hennessy Group Research believes a primary contributor to the rise and fall of Iceland's economy was the vast size that the country's financial sector grew to relative to its GDP and fiscal capacity. Guidante says, quote, Iceland's three main banks, Kaupthing, Landsbank, and Glitnir, I may be mispronouncing those, built total liabilities of approximately 10 times the size of their gross domestic product, up from about 2 times in 2003. In addition, approximately 80% of the liabilities were in foreign currencies, leaving them at risk of a currency collapse, unquote. As the market seized up, Iceland's banks started to collapse under the heap of foreign debt they took on over the years. As concerns mounted about the stability of Iceland's banks, foreign investors fled the country, prompting the value of its currency to drop nearly 50% in just 1 week. The collapse of the currency left banks and citizens with loans originated in foreign currencies in a very tenuous situation. The weakening currency led to their debt obligations nearly doubling. As the nation's economic crisis deepened, unemployment rose from 1% to 10%, inflation soared to nearly 18%, and the stock market lost approximately 90% of its value. Hennessy Group Research believes that while Iceland's circumstances were unique in many ways, there are countries suffering from similar risks which could leave them just as vulnerable in the current crisis. One particular statistic of concern is the large amounts of external debt certain countries are currently carrying relative to the size of their economy, GDP, and will continue to build as they battle the economic slowdown. While there has been a lot of discussion regarding the mounting debt of the U.S. to recently implemented bailout programs and stimulus packages, Hennessy Group Research believes the U.S. appears relatively stable in comparison to their international counterparts. Currently, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio is approximately 100%, with the bulk of its external debt mostly in dollars. Repeating that by way of emphasis, because this is some fairly dense analysis, currently, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio is approximately 100%, with the bulk of its external debt mostly in dollars. The Netherlands currently has a ratio of approximately 328%, while Ireland has built a debt to GDP ratio of 900%. However, the two countries that appear most susceptible to an economic collapse are the UK and Switzerland. The UK's debt-to-GDP ratio is currently 456%, while Switzerland's is 433%. Gradante says, quote, while these countries are much bigger than Iceland, they do share certain characteristics that make them vulnerable to further economic hardship. Both countries have developed into major financial intermediaries over time and have grown sizable external debts that are denominated in foreign currencies, unquote. Now, all of this, of course, is very troubling indeed, and we should not lose sight of what the Great Depression produced. It produced, among other things, wide popular support for fascism. I would not say that it produced fascism. That was an outgrowth of really globalization, as explained, by the way, in the introduction to the books section of the SpitfireList.com website. And others are noting the economic collapse and what it is likely to produce politically. By the way, don't go contacting the FCC over the last name of the British minister. This is actually his last name. The following is from the British Telegraph, the Daily Telegraph, of February 10th of 2009. It's an article by Christopher Hope, headlined, Ed Balls, Minister fears rise of fascism amid economic gloom. Subtitled, The economic crisis could spark a resurgence in the far right, a close ally of Prime Minister Gordon Brown has suggested. It reads in part, Ed Balls, the Children's and Schools Secretary, said the downturn was likely to be the most serious for 100 years, and his comments appeared to raise the prospect of a return to the far-right politics of the 1930s and the rise of fascism. His warning in a speech to activists at the weekend came after a trade union baron warned that far-right parties were trying to hijack the campaign for British jobs for British workers, unquote. The row over foreign workers has gathered momentum in recent weeks, and Mr. Ball seemed to suggest the recession could trigger a return to the far-right politics that prospered in the Great Depression of the 1930s. He told Labour's Yorkshire Conference, quote, the economy is going to define our politics in this region and in Britain in the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10, and even the next 15 years. Quote, I think this is a financial crisis more extreme and more serious than that of the 1930s, and we all remember how the politics of that era were shaped by the economy, unquote. The remarks are significant because Mr. Balls was a key advisor to Mr. Brown during his decade at the Treasury as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Mr. Balls said that he believed this to be, quote, the most serious global recession for over 100 years, unquote. He said, again quoting, we now are seeing the realities of globalization, though at a speed, pace, and ferocity which none of us could have seen before. The reality is that this is becoming the most serious global recession for, I'm sure, over 100 years, as it will turn out, unquote. Last week, Derek Simpson, the General Secretary of Unite, gave warning that far-right elements were hijacking a campaign against foreign firms bringing in non-British workers. He said, quote, we are deeply concerned that other organizations like the BNP are latching onto the movement for their own racist agenda, unquote. Well, now it isn't just Dave Emory warning about the rise of fascism, is it, folks? Now the British cabinet is warning about the same thing. Well, it doesn't look good, but that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, and you could do nothing better than to join in the effort. Use the information at SpitfireList.com, and also you can support the work that I'm doing because, folks, it is very important indeed. This concludes For the Record program number 665, Update on the Meltdown, Part 2. This has been recorded on March 1st of 2009. My name is Dave Emory. Thanks for listening.